Hey there, welcome back to U.S. History. If you're wondering why we're in the dark, it's because I'm so used to being just by myself now and a shut-in that I only operate in the dark. No, I'm just teasing. My wife pointed out, she was watching a video and she was like, that ceiling light would annoy the fire out of me. She goes, if I were watching this thing. So I'm just trying it with the lamp here, with all the lights shut off. Hopefully that works. So we're going to pick up with Winning the Peace on page 470. So this all started in Germany, where the Nazis were trying to come up with this huge bomb using uranium. And so there was a Jewish scientist who left Germany once he saw the attempted extermination, the Holocaust beginning to take place. His name was Albert Einstein. And so when he fled to the United States, he wrote a letter to FDR saying, this is what's going on. I think we need to start, and we need to beat them in the race to creating this bomb, this atomic bomb. And so FDR took him up on this, and he started this new secret project called the Manhattan Project. This was a top secret U.S. operation, the race to create the atom bomb, and it was located just west of Knoxville, Tennessee, where they created literally a whole secret city called Oak Ridge, where they had thousands of workers in this city creating and helping create this atomic bomb. And by the way, WOMD, that stands for Weapon of Mass Destruction, or Weapons of Mass Destruction. Now, before the finished creation of the atomic bomb, FDR died from a stroke and was replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman. Harry Truman's an interesting character. I can bring up his bio here real quick. Born in Missouri, he is actually the only 20th century president who did not attend college. And he also did not live in the White House for most of his administration because it was being renovated at that time. But anyway, that's a little bit about Harry Truman. And so they they were able to create this atomic bomb. And once it was finished, Harry Truman said, we're going to demand that the Japanese surrender. If Japan doesn't, then we're going to use this atomic bomb. He said if we don't use it, then millions of American and Japanese lives could be lost. Because think about it. If Japanese soldiers had nothing to lose and were willing to commit suicide and fight to the death, surrender was not in the near future. And so many more lives were going to be lost if they were to continue fighting. But he said, maybe we can spare lives by dropping this atomic bomb and ending it right here, right now. And so he went to the Potsdam Conference, which was in Germany, and he declared that Japan should surrender. But Japan, they refused to surrender. And so after they refused to surrender, the Enola Gay, this plane here, was loaded up with the first atomic bomb called, and I think this one was called Little Boy. Right here, that was the nickname for this first uranium atomic bomb, Little Boy. It was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. It killed let's see, how many people did it kill here? Killed about 80,000 Japanese civilians. Japan still did not surrender. And so 3 days later, I believe it was 3 days later, they were able to, this was dropped on August 6th. Yes, so 3 days later, August 9th, they dropped Fat Man, that was the second bomb, on Nagasaki. And this killed about 40,000 people. And so there still is, to this day, a moral debate. Should the United States have dropped these bombs and killed innocent civilians? And so it's something that's up for discussion and debate even to this day. Harry Truman went to his grave saying that he would have done it all over again, and that he doesn't regret dropping the bombs because, in his opinion, he ended the war sooner than it would have if they would have not dropped the bombs. Okay, so U.S. bombed Hiroshima, killing 80,000 people. Then they bombed Nagasaki. You need to know the order in which these cities were bombed. Hiroshima first, Nagasaki second. And Japan ended up surrendering on the very next day. Douglas MacArthur was sent to Japan to receive their written surrender. He met two clerks or two assistants from the Japanese emperor on the USS Missouri. And I think that there was a picture of this. Oh, here we go. In your textbook, let me bring it up here. So here's the picture right here. World War II officially ended with the signing of the terms of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri. And so then that brings us to the Nuremberg trials. Nazi war criminals were tried in the Nuremberg trials. This is where they were put on trial and to see whether or not they were guilty from war crimes. It says in your book on page 472. I'm going to bring it up. I think this is interesting. It says of 24 individuals that were indicted, 3 were found innocent, 12 were sentenced to death, 7 received sentences ranging from 10 years in prison to life imprisonment. 1 committed suicide, and 1 was released without going to trial. The death sentences were carried out by hangings on October 16, 1946, and the others were sent to Spandau prison. Japanese war criminals were also put on trial, but that was in Asia, where they were put on trial. So now the war has ended. Okay, it's done. But if you remember, during the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, Russia, and Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and FDR put together a plan for what would happen after the war. And if you remember, Russia got to Berlin first and controlled a lot of that territory. The United States would end up splitting Berlin, but Germany would remain largely under Soviet control. And so let's take a look at what this looked like here. So here's the map after World War II. You see the Soviet Union, which includes Russia. It goes into most or a lot of Germany here, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. Those remained under Russian control. And then these are countries here who were controlled by the Allies. Later on, we'll talk about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But we said that Berlin was split in two, just like Germany, but Berlin is actually located in East Germany. How does this work? So West Germany was controlled by the United States, France, and Britain, while East Germany, in East Germany was controlled by the Soviets, but Berlin was also split in two. And so you almost have like a microcosm of Germany itself. West Germany belonging to the Allied powers, East Germany belonging to Russia. Berlin was also split into two, where West Berlin was controlled by the United States, it was controlled by France and the British, England, whereas East Berlin was controlled by the Soviets. So this is going to be a major factor in the Cold War, in that this portion of Berlin is technically free, even though it's surrounded by East Germany controlled by the Soviets. And it's going to play a major factor in the Cold War that we'll talk about in a later chapter. Okay, so the United States, you need to know, was established the United States established a temporary government in Japan. Douglas MacArthur would take over as the leader of Japan until they were able to build Japan back up from the ground up. And so that kind of brings us to a close of World War II. But first, I want to talk about this quick story concerning Russian spies in the United States. Well, there was this Air Force officer who was somewhere up north. I don't remember if it was Montana. I think it was in Montana. There was this Air Force base. And you must remember reading about the Lend-Lease Act, which was signed by the United States saying that they would give supplies to any allied country that needed it. Well, after Russia joined the Allied powers, America began sending supplies to Russia to help them in the war effort. Well, Russian pilots would fly planes from Russia across the Bering Sea into North America and land in this Air Force base that I believe we'll just say for now was in Montana. But this one Air Force officer, he began to realize that something unusual was going on. Whenever these planes would land, the Russian pilots would get out of their plane. They would run as fast as they could to the edge of the compound, climb the fence, and once they got to the other side, there were always these black cars waiting for them. They would get into the back of the black car and they would ride off. Then, of course, the Americans would load up these Russian planes with supplies. And then these Russian pilots, they would fly these planes back to Russia. Well, there was one night where this officer realized something unusual was going on. And just to give you some notice, over this whole period of time where he's noticed some unusual things, he's kept a little black book where he would write names, he would write things that he saw, just in case they would come up at some point in time, and he would be able to give evidence of something that he thought was going on. And he always approached his higher commanders and would say, I don't know what's going on here, but something fishy is going on. They would say, just mind your business. That's above your pay grade. You just need to do your job. Well, one night, it was actually a rainy night, pretty good setting for this story. One of these Russian planes was being loaded in a very fast manner, and they were really trying to get out of there in a hurry. And so he tried to step onto the plane to check the cargo. But there were two Russian soldiers with automatic rifles that stepped in front of him, and they said, you can't get on this plane. And he said, I am an Air Force commanding officer. He said, this is our Air Force base. You're on U.S. property. We need to see what's on that plane. Two soldiers wouldn't let him. And so he said, I'll be right back. He went and got some backup, more soldiers with more powerful automatic rifles, and they approached the plane. And once those two Russians saw what was going on, they stepped down. The pilots tried to frantically get in front of this Air Force officer before he could see what was on that plane, but he shoved them out of the way, and they were detained by the Americans who were backing him up. And so he went to the cargo hold, and what he found was this large mound covered by this tan-colored tarp. And once he uncovered this tan-colored tarp, what he found were piles upon piles of briefcases. He opened up these briefcases and he found stacks of paper. And he began reading these papers, just scanning over them to see if there was anything that he could put into his little black book. Made some notes of some things that he had never heard of, wrote them down. But really, he couldn't do anything about it. He said, okay, these are papers. We have to let them go. There's nothing we can do. So they closed everything up, let the pilots take off and go back to Russia. Whenever it was a meeting, there was a meeting that took place between Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, and the British Prime Minister. And it was said that Harry Truman leaned over to Stalin and said, I've just found out that we have a weapon that will be able to end this war quickly once and for all, speaking of the atomic bomb. And one of Truman's aides said that he noticed Stalin didn't sound surprised. He wasn't ecstatic. He just kept looking ahead where the photographers were taking their pictures, and he just smiled softly, and he said, as if he had already known about what Truman was speaking of. Well, if you were to open up that little black book written by that Air Force officer, some of the names and words that were on those pieces of paper in those briefcases were the words Manhattan Project, atomic bomb, Knoxville, Tennessee, and things of that nature. Turns out, Joseph Stalin had already known about the atomic bomb, and the Russians were making the bomb themselves, maybe to be used on the United States.